So greetings, hello, it's Dr. Thomas Daffin here for my weekly address dealing with contemporary geopolitics, peace, ethics, spirituality and what philosophers and intellectuals and ordinary good people throughout the world can be doing about the situation we find ourselves in as a planet. I'm particularly addressing my fellow English speakers, I suppose. I'm speaking in English, addressing the people of the UK and also in Europe where I live, here in France, but also, the wider Commonwealth, 53 nations, because the crisis Britain is facing over Brexit will impact on the entire Commonwealth. I'm a Canadian, lived for many years in Canada, I was born there, and I came back to Britain like my father had before me after living in Canada, out of real love for Britain. I love the culture, and although it's a tiny set of islands, Britain and Ireland and offshore islands, it's had a wonderful impact on world history in the balance for good and evil. I like to think more for good. We learned through bitter civil wars in Britain actually that the best way to manage politics is through constitutional law, through tolerance, moderation. What I was brought up to call fair play. I was taught to play cricket as a boy. I was quite good. There were certain rules and values that were inculcated into us that if an opponent's down, you don't kick them, beat them up, defeat them. You have to be moderate even in your aggression. One of the things that upsets me about Brexit is that it's as if the stubbornness of the British character is now saying, well, we're going to do it because we can, we're a powerful people. But it's now self-destructive because Brexit is going to lead to the breakup of the very thing that these people are supposed to be valuing, i.e. the UK. As I've demonstrated again and again rationally, and many people are finally beginning, the penny's dropping. So it's completely ridiculous. It's about as sensible as a cricket team going on playing as the Titanic sinks. There's a point at which you say, actually, this is not helping. And that attitude of stubbornness, which now Boris Johnson has, the guy's a retrograde. He's like Mercury in reverse or something. Completely misusing any degree of intelligence that he has from his education, which was, excellent. But his performance at school was abysmal. If you look at the comments from his housemaster at Eton, and my own daughter actually met the person that taught him English. Very interesting. I think he's misused the educational abilities that he had and is misusing them dangerously on behalf of the Tory party, which he will destroy. The Conservative Party is about to be destroyed if he's elected its leader and then implements or tries to implement a so-called hard Brexit or absolute Brexit. This is a recipe for self-destruction for the Conservative Party, for the UK, for himself. There's no winners here, except perhaps his own ego. And we know that's quite big from the tapes with his girlfriend, his arguments. He fancies himself. We, the British people, scattered, including those that live in Europe, cannot afford to let a man of this poor ethical judgment attempt to take over the levers of power. I believe he will be stopped sooner or later. I think the Conservative Party itself has to do some serious soul-searching. And I would recommend every single decent, honourable Conservative to leave the Conservative Party if Mr. Boris Johnson is elected its leader, so-called. Resign, join another party like the Lib Dems. It's a Remain party, a moderate party, even if just temporarily, just to sort of stop this Brexit catastrophe. And ideally, all the MPs who are of moderate disposition, who are in Parliament in the Conservative Party, should also resign the whip, join a coalition of Remainers and vote Brexit down. I believe that's what's going to happen. I'm praying that will happen. I'm fasting every Sunday for that to happen, along with millions of other people. I'm not marching because I don't live in England, but I'm there in spirit with all the marchers who are marching, and many of my friends and family are doing so. So that's the background. That's why I feel so passionate about all this issue. Let me just put this in context. What are we celebrating today? Well, here in France, we're celebrating what's called Bastille Day, which celebrates the freeing of the prisoners in the Bastille in Paris, which was a military fort. It was like a castle. It's like the Tower of London, but in Paris. And it was built actually to defend against the English during the horrible 100 Years' War, when war crimes were committed actually by the English against the French. And only when I moved here to France did I realise that all these kind of war heroes that were taught as boys and girls in English history lessons, like the Black Prince, were actually war criminals. He slaughtered mercilessly and in cold blood the inhabitants of Limoges, which is my nearest big city in Limousin, a beautiful city. It didn't want to surrender to him. When he captured it finally, he just killed everyone, thousands of people, men, women and children. The man was a war criminal. He never faced trial, although he did get his comeuppance karmically, because he then got very ill and he never recovered. Well, thank God for God, because God sends, karmic retribution on people. The English also slaughtered and killed in cold blood a seer and a visionary, Joan of Arc, who to me was like a latter-day Druidess. She was hearing voices from the archangels, channeling divine messages to get these English brutes out of France. And she incredibly managed to, we know her history, she managed to persuade the French nobility that it was time for a fight back. And she managed to capture Orleans, which was an ancient Celtic Druid city, from very ancient times, before the Romans came. They found these oppida, as Caesar called them, the Roman word for towns, all over Europe, all over Gaul, all over the Rhine Valley, all over Bavaria, all over Austria and the Celtic region, Czechoslovakia. Even on down into Hungary, there were these oppida. These were Celtic fortified towns, cities actually, some of them proto-cities, like one near Munich, Manching and other places, which archaeologists have been discovering over the last few decades. Fascinating stuff. To me, Joan of Arc was from the Champagne region, which was a Druid stronghold in ancient times. And so what did the English do? Well, we accused her of witchcraft and burnt her alive. It shows the poverty of the spiritual imagination of the people that were running Britain at the time. The king, Henry VI, who was a boy king, didn't really have the power to know what was going on or how to stop it. To try and make amends, he later founded Eton College, which is where a lot of prime ministers have been trained. I think he should have written something into the founding documents of Eton College that anyone that graduates from here should take an oath of veracity and not misuse their education. I want to commemorate, therefore, Bastille Day, but I'll come to that a bit later. First, I want to mention that today, 14th of July, we've just had recently, on the 12th of July, a date of some significance to me personally and to my work. Namely, it's the birthday of Dr. John Dee, who was a Cambridge graduate and a mathematician, and a magus and a philosopher, and he was like England's Renaissance figure, like Pico della Mirandola in Florence, or Ficino, who were attached to the Florence Academy. Dee was the equivalent in England and was the tutor of Queen Elizabeth I. One of my strongest arguments against Brexit is that Elizabeth wouldn't have liked it. She wasn't a fool. Elizabeth was a very clever woman. I've studied her life and works in detail. She wanted to be what she called the via moderata, the middle way between extremes, between extreme Catholic, extreme Protestant. Her instinct was for peace. She'd nearly been killed by her, she was investigated, had she been involved in plots against Mary when her sister was the Catholic monarch. No, she hadn't. She'd stuck to her studies. She was learned in Latin, in French, in Italian. She read poetry, she wrote stuff. She was a scholar, old Elizabeth. And so Dee and her had an amazing friendship, what I call a wisdom affair. She was a virgin queen, but spiritually, Dee and her had what I call a wisdom affair. And he was a magus. He was an extraordinary man. He had the largest library in Britain at the time. And he's the model of Prospero for Shakespeare, who knew Dee, probably personally, certainly in his circle. And, he was a friend of the Earl of Northumberland in Sion House, where the Earl of Northumberland had his London base, Henry Percy, who was a sponsor of Dee and of the early scientific community. What Dee was doing was trying to use science to further the peace and the prosperity of the realm. These people were inventing the scientific revolution, and it was Francis Bacon who was like a protege of that circle. Himself a very learned and quicksilver mind, who then wrote down what they'd been thinking at Sion House, which became the famous book, The Advancement of Learning. I love Francis Bacon's work. The advancement of learning should be taught to every secondary school kid in Britain. It's one of our greatest achievements. What Bacon said in that work, he presented it to the next monarch, James, is, look, this is the state of knowledge in our country. We know this, we know that, we know a bit about that, but honestly we don't know anything about that. And as for that, we don't even have a name for it yet. So it was a survey by a topographer of knowledge of the whole of knowledge and what needs to be done to improve it. And he said the only way we can seriously improve knowledge is with a new method, which involves scientific method. Bacon virtually invented this concept in the British context on the back of the work of Dee and his generation and the people associated with the Earl of Northumberland, who was, for instance, in their circle, Robert Record invented the symbols for algebra, including the equal sign. Thomas Harriot was another one. And they also were the first people in England to use telescopes. They had the telescope to look at the moon and stars before Galileo did, right? At the time of Queen Elizabeth. This was the English Renaissance. And a lot of it was done in secret because, knowledge is dangerous, right? That was what Bacon said, knowledge is power. Well, okay, but knowledge is dangerous. And so you could be accused of sorcery or whatever. And Dee was, simply because he was a man of science and a pioneer. He was a pioneer also in many other ways, because he was a pioneer of what we would call psychical research. Dee is a Christian, a Gnostic, an esoteric Christian, a true Catholic in the best sense of the term, wanted ultimate truth, so he wanted to see what happens after death. Where do spirits go? What happens? Where are the angels? Can we talk to them? So he pioneered a kind of parapsychological research into the afterlife, and he was interested in what's called scrying, including like looking into a bowl of water and seeing how the ripples and reflections work. Well, this apparently is a very ancient thing that the ancient Etruscans used to do. The Etruscans used to be into scrying in bowls of water. There's a whole tradition of the Etruscans called the Disciplina Etruria, which was the ancient wisdom of the Etruscans, which the Romans were taught religion from. The Romans were not originally very pious. They were not particularly intelligent, bless them. They were just a bunch of farmers in a few hills on the Tiber. And it was from the Etruscans they learned, the alphabet. They borrowed the Etruscan alphabet, and that became the Latin alphabet. And that's the one that all of Western Europe uses now. All my books are written with it. Well, it's the Etruscan alphabet, thank you very much. And then the Etruscans taught, piety, spirituality, and to be constantly aware of the presence of the gods, and to act in such a way that your deeds will stand scrutiny. The word temple comes from the Etruscan seership skills that they developed. Now, Dee was working with all this stuff. He knew all this stuff. So did his somebody he'd heard of, Cardinal Egidio de Viterbo, who was in Rome as a cardinal at the time, and slightly before Dee. So Dee would have known of his work, and he was very interested in the Etruscans, and so were the Roman savants. They knew, as good scholars, that most of Roman spirituality had come from the Etruscans. So did the Emperor Claudius, who wrote a book about the Etruscans. He was married to an Etruscan, was old Claudius, performed in that wonderful production by the BBC of I Claudius by Graves. And unfortunately that book has not come down. It's the lost work of Claudius on the Etruscans. My suspicion is he wanted to invade Britain because he wanted to sort of go and interview loads of Druids, because he wanted to know what their practices were compared to the Etruscans. I don't think Claudius needed to invade for that. He could have just asked permission from the Archdruids of Britain. We would have been happy to interview him, let him come into the country. And he could have, talked to some Archdruids and written a great book about Druidry to balance his one on the Etruscans. But unfortunately, being Roman, and semi-civilized, he had to turn up with a huge army, which led to lots of deaths, as performed recently in that wonderful series Britannia, which I love. I did a good review for it. I know it was a bit silly, but then it's just a fictionalized version of historical events. So anyway, Dee, of Welsh descent, was very much in the mould of the Druid advising Elizabeth I, and when she bequeathed her throne to James of Scotland, she knew what she was doing. She wanted to unite the two crowns of England and Scotland. She didn't want any trouble. And she thought and realised that Britain would become a great power if we could just get these Scots and these English and these Welsh to collaborate in peace. And that was in 1603 when she died, and James inherited the double crown. And it's ever since, touch wood, more or less, stayed as one united project. And that gave birth to Shakespeare, gave birth to the enlightenment of British culture and civilization and science, as the best elements of Scottish thinkers, the best elements of English and Welsh, we all contributed. And it was built on an earlier foundational substratum of this Druid wisdom that was represented by Dee. And with the additional substratum of the Christian wisdom, this Gnostic incredible teaching that had come from Galilee, and this amazing rabbi who defeated the jaws of death. The Druids loved him because he was like a Druid. Columba, St. Ninian, all the early Christians of Britain, St. Alban and so on, they all loved Jesus because he'd embodied and acted out the Druid role, or the Archdruid, Now this was all known at the court of Queen Elizabeth and John Dee. This is what their conversations were about. And they were saying, how can we ensure that this little island of wisdom and peace flourishes, that we can develop the sciences, and not just for ourselves, but for the betterment of all humanity. So that's what Francis Bacon wrote in The Advancement of Learning to her successor James. Said, look, this is how we can do it. And later that led to the founding of the Royal Society, that led to the scientific enlightenment, which then has gone around the world. This is why we have electric lights, it's why we have cameras that can film talks. It's why we have the internet, which was an invention of another great British scientist based at CERN, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who's a great Unitarian philosopher and based at the MIT now. So the point of all this is to advance and better the whole condition of the human condition, so that people don't have to live in slavery, poverty, fear of war, cruelty, etc. What I've called for is a new edition of the Advancement of Learning 400 years later, because the final edition was 1624 during Charles I's reign, and it was the final edition. What I'm saying is, let's have a new edition, a new update. Let's do a new survey of the topography of all knowledge. We know an awful lot more than we did in Bacon's day, but there are still huge gaps. We don't know the actual structure and the evolution of the solar system. We don't know if Velikovsky is at all right-ish in arguing that planets move about. We don't know that for sure. We don't know exactly the evolution of the hominid line of Homo sapiens. We don't know how all these bones and things fit together, the puzzle. We don't know why there are anomalous kind of footprints found in Permian or ancient strata that are 60 million years ago, which defeat all the laws of traditional evolutionary theory, and so on and so on. There are many, many things we don't know. I'm just writing a book about the egg with a scientific colleague or two of mine, and there are things we don't know at the micro level of the cell and its organisation. At what point is there any kind of evidence of some kind of intelligence at work in the structuration of say a cell that creates an egg? It's so incredibly sophisticated. How did it evolve? Who thought of this? Was there any thinking, or is it totally random? Who thought of the egg? Where did the egg come from? If it came from the chicken, then where did that chicken come from? We're asking some of those questions in the Book of the Egg, which will be published in a few months. And so there's some other things we don't know. The most important thing we don't know is about peace. And my suggestion for a new advancement of learning project, which I'm suggesting all the scientific academies of the world get involved with, like the Royal Society and the equivalents in other countries, a topography of knowledge, that it includes the peace sciences. So there's an awful lot known about conflict research, conflict resolution. My colleagues in the Conflict Research Society, in other bodies like the International Studies Association and so on, huge amounts is known about conflict and how to resolve it. But it's not being applied. Why do we still have a semi-barbarous kind of situation when American leader Trump, Israeli leader Netanyahu can do a war of words against an Islamic leader in Iran who seems to be saying, look, we don't want nuclear weapons, we're not building them, it's against God's will, and yet the media in the West are all ratcheting up, hate speech against this guy, Rouhani, who spoke at the UN General Assembly with incredible dignity and gravitas. Watch his discourse and compare it to Trump and Netanyahu. It's like they're on some kind of malevolent pill that gives you, brain malfunction in terms of aggressiveness, whereas Rouhani spoke as a true statesman, as a true leader. And I'm speaking just objectively as a philosopher, that's what appears to me. So there's a huge gap between what's known about conflict resolution and peace theory and then how it's applied in reality. That is a problem, because of that gap, we're in danger of losing this planet. This planet is a precious planet in the evolutionary scheme of things. Although we don't know, how it's put here and why, my assumption, my sort of working hypothesis, is that there is a reason for it. That we were created to be here as a place of love, peace, joy, harmony, and wisdom. And yes, struggle, strife, and conflict, but not ultimately. We're supposed to be able to work through that, like little kids. They fight, when they're young, and then they grow out of it. So anyway, I'm hoping that, and to me, Brexit is a product of that combative spirit, that semi-demonic kind of fallen spirit that wants everything on its own terms. It's ego, if you want. In the Book of Enoch, it talks about the fallen angels sowing the first instruments of war. They're the guys that make the first weapons. Brexit is a project of the fallen angels. I'm sorry, there's no way around it. And if you listen to my commentary on the books of Enoch, you'll know what I'm talking about. And they just need to be educated. That was Enoch's mission. And that's why Enoch was allowed to see into heaven. And it's interesting that Dee used Enochian communication systems, because he was another transporter in the tradition of Enoch, working for the good of the planet as a whole. And we must continue to do that tirelessly, and that's why I oppose Brexit with all the strength of my spiritual convictions and intellectual reason. I also now want to move on to, I've just finished a commentary on St. Paul's letter to the Galatians. I'm working through gradually the whole Bible with a series of commentaries that I want to bequeath to my successors. Because what I'm trying to do is apply my doctoral findings on transpersonal history, which is a new way of studying history, involving the application of transpersonal psychology to these classic texts which we've thought of as religious. Well, okay, fine, they're religious, like the Quran and stuff. But I'm saying we can rationally explore them. We can see what they're actually meaning by peeking into the psychology behind their what they say and what we can infer of the person's consciousness that was writing them. So in my commentaries on Paul, it's very interesting. And the Galatians is a great letter because he's writing to these Celtic tribes in Anatolia, who provided the bodyguard, it would seem, for Herod, interesting enough, in Jerusalem, and also provided the bodyguard for Cleopatra in Alexandria. They were famous fighters, these Galatians. And they had, before, from ancient times, they had their druids in situ. And it's interesting that Ankara was one of their cities. They founded Ankara, in fact, these Galatians. So they're quite interesting. As I discover, many druids, in Europe and Celts were doing lots of interesting stuff. Paul, in this wonderful letter, basically says that we have to work tirelessly to maintain spiritual freedom. That we should act selflessly, we should do good in life, and his message to the Galatians is don't sort of fall for the outer trappings of becoming a Christian, or whatever somebody says you have to do, like you have to shave your head in a particular way, or be circumcised, or eat certain foods, or whatever. No, the point of Christ's life, birth, death, and resurrection is to transcend all that legalism, and that if we come from a place of spiritual gnosis and grace and freedom, then we know what the right thing to do is in any given situation. You don't have to follow the code or the manual. In effect, you go back to the Druid wisdom, which is they didn't write down the laws. They knew what was right and wrong because it's engraved on everyone's heart. And that's what the whole biblical tradition says. That's what all the prophets had said right from the beginning. Isaiah, you read them. The law of God is written on everyone's heart. That was the Enochian law, if you want, or the Noahite law, as other people like John Selden, the great English jurist at the time of the tragic civil war in England, who had irons in both sides. He was a great man at the Temple in London, consulted by Cromwell and others. And these people were trying to find what is truth, what is justice. How can we live from that? Well, we have to go to the common law, which is within all of us, the Noahide law, the Enochian law. And that's not written down. That's the Druid law. That's the innate sense of honour and decency and right and wrong that each of us has within our identity, our souls. That's what Paul is saying. That's what Christ came, was to bring that back. And I'm speaking, says Paul, I used to be a legalist, persecuting and punishing, I used to be a parking attendant warden who would clobber people if they were 30 seconds over their stay. That kind of mentality is what this planet is dying from. It's the parking warden types who are clobbering the free driver types. And we have to get free of that. That's what Paul's saying. Well, Brexit is, to me, is a project, a nightmare project, which is going to make things much worse, because I can appreciate, some of my compatriots in Britain think, no, it's great, it's little Britain's going for freedom, we're the great nation of pioneers, we can do it. Well, okay, but there's an arrogance in that position, which Paul warns against. He says, whatever you do, don't go for arrogance. Because that is, let us have no self-conceit. If we live by the Spirit, let us also walk by the Spirit, he says towards the end of Galatians. And if somebody does make a mistake, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Well, that's what I'm trying to do with my fellow compatriots who think Brexit is a good idea. In a spirit of gentleness, I'm trying to say, look, think again, because it's not. It's self-deceptive and going to lead to the breakup of our beloved country, which, if we are an instrument of good, then let's keep it together and let's get on with some good work. What the UK should be doing is helping with things like peace, mediation work in the Middle East. We have a lot of experience in diplomacy. I think it's very tragic that our diplomat in America should, have to resign. Give him another post somewhere in the Middle East where he can go on telling the truth. Our little country should be able to stand up against American bullying and the kind of false narrative that it's creating to justify its wars in Iraq, and it thinks it can do a war in Iran. I sincerely hope that it will realise that no, you can't just act like a sort of overgrown adolescent testosterone-fueled bully without consequences. There is spiritual law governing this planet, and there is karma, and so if you act like that, karma comes back on you. So no, we don't want to go down that route. We want to keep the UK together and make it a voice of peace and reason and truth and genuine science. We are very good at doing science. Let's do that within the bigger European context. People like my colleague Sir Paul Nurse and many other great scientists are saying, don't leave the European Union. We want to be part of that bigger pool of mind capacity that can really crack the things we need to be working on, like medical breakthroughs and Alzheimer's. It'd be lovely to get a cure for Alzheimer's, which is a terrible disease that people suffer from. My father died of it, How does it function? What causes it? Why do people lose their memory and when they get old? This is things we should be working on, not Brexit, which has already cost billions just planning for it. And it's going to cost billions and billions of lost revenue, lost money. And as Scotland leaves the UK, it will be disastrous, especially for England, to lose, half of Britain sailing off into rejoining the EU and so on. The people that are thinking about Brexit are just literally, they haven't got a clue as to the consequences. They're not able to think the 4 or 5 steps ahead that you need to play chess even. So go and work it out. Listen to my other talks. And realise, as Paul says, karma comes back on you, and so we have to go on talking the truth, not grow weary in well-doing, as he says. It's beautiful. So anyway, I've done a whole commentary on the whole text of many of Paul's letters and the 4 Gospels, and also the other Gospels of St. Thomas and Mary Magdalene. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So I'm celebrating also today because I'm finishing a book which is about to be published in a week or 2 or 3, however long it takes to finish the spell checking, towards the Centre for Bremain Studies. And what I'm proposing is that instead of Brexit, we should do Bremain, which is its converse. And I've written, 250-page detailed study of why that is a much more intelligent choice. Some of which I've summarised in these talks once a week, but the detail is in the book, which I'm working on at the moment. And I'm in touch with political scientists and specialists in conflict prevention around the place to try and develop this. One of the arguments I put forward in the Centre for Bremain Studies book is from the position of love studies. Now, you may or may not know this, but one of my many specialisms as a philosopher and historian is as a pioneering person interested in love studies. Now, you've not heard of that. There's no degrees you can do in it, sadly. You can do war studies degrees, but you can't study love. And yet it's the most important thing, I would say, for all of us. And I'm talking the whole rainbow experience of love, everything from physical, emotional, erotic, intellectual, spiritual, divine, the whole rainbow of love. It's what the planet is based on. And yet I founded the only journal of love studies in the world, the Love Journal, a journal of compassion, love, peace and altruism studies. There isn't one anywhere in the entire planet. You look. I went round the whole of the States looking for one back in 1992. There wasn't, so I came back in 93 and launched it. It's in its 13th issue. And I'm looking at, seriously, at the scientific study of how cooperation and altruism works out better for everyone. This is enshrined in game theory, and economists have won Nobel Prizes for pointing out the obvious, that if people cooperate, they both have a better chance of survival than if they compete against each other. But love studies is a very broad field. And one of my arguments for keeping the UK together is that it's a much more loving thing to do.